Our guest today is former Georgia Congressman Bob Barr and successful attorney. Bob is also recognized as a constitutional attorney, and he led the successful impeachment of former President Bill Clinton. Congressman Barr, we appreciate your taking time out of your busy schedule to have this extended conversation on your views as you seek to become the next congressman representing Georgia's 11th district.
Thank you, Michael.
Congressman Barr, tell us about your political philosophy and guiding principles, and as a second part to that question, why are you running again for Congress?
Well, the answer to both questions is the Constitution. The Constitution underlies my views on politics generally, my views on public policy and public service, and it is the reason that I'm running to return to the Congress from the 11th District of Georgia. To me, the Constitution of the United States of America is the most magnificent document ever written by the hand of man. As Thomas Jefferson declared many years ago, it truly is the very best document that personifies or that lays out a structure for what government should be, and that is simply a means, a mechanism to ensure liberty. It's not a mechanism to take power from the people, although that's what it has become by the way it's been used by generations now of political leaders in Washington and at the state level and even at the local level. But if we adhere to the Constitution, we would have a system of government in this country that maximizes individual liberty and minimizes government power. And to me, that ought to be the guiding philosophy or the roadmap, as it were, for governance, to maximize individual liberty and minimize government power. Now, obviously, that's not what our government at any level has become. And that worries me a great deal. Of course, as you know from having worked with me over many years, that was the guiding principle for my 8 years that I served in the Congress previously. And the fact that we continue to drift so far from that core philosophy, Michael, is why I made a decision to, as Charlton Heston said, get back in the arena, the name of his autobiography, In the Arena. You can't win the fight for freedom unless you're in the arena. And the fight for freedom has become so important, so critical, that I could no longer simply fight for freedom in the private sector. I felt taking my skills, the background that I have, the prior experience in the Congress of having been able to get some things done and standing for the rule of law against the illegalities of former President Clinton, as you mentioned, have become so important that it has forced me really back into the arena to run for public office again.
There's a statement by one of our founders: when the government fears the people, there is freedom. When the people fear the government, there is tyranny.
And that's largely what we have now. We have the tyranny of the bureaucracy, we have the tyranny of the IRS, we have the tyranny of public officials who go to Washington, seems often, Michael, for no reason other than simply to be able to exercise as much control, the big C, control over the people as possible. That's certainly not what our government was intended to be, and it was not the vision envisioned by our founders.
Bob, you're a constitutional attorney, and you believe that our Second and Fourth Amendments are under attack. Can you give us some insight into your reasoning and the importance of these amendments? And just for the benefit of our viewers, let me read the Second Amendment. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed.
It's one of the shorter amendments in the Bill of Rights, and it's actually pretty darn straightforward, more straightforward perhaps than some of the other provisions in the Bill of Rights or some of the other amendments to the Constitution that came after those original 10. But despite its brevity and despite its clarity, it was not, as you know, until 2008, just a few short years ago, that the U.S. Supreme Court did not step forward and declare with finality that the Second Amendment does indeed guarantee the individual right to keep and bear arms. The gun control folks for decades had argued that because of the prefatory language, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. They took that prefatory language and said, aha, you see, it talks about a militia, therefore only the National Guard should have firearms, for example. Well, that's utter nonsense, of course, and has no basis at all in history, but that sort of view of the Second Amendment held sway among many people in Washington and at the state level, such as Mayor Bloomberg, and locally for many, many years. But thank goodness in 2008, in the Heller case, the Heller versus District of Columbia case, the Supreme Court finally declared that the right of the people to keep and bear arms guarantees an individual right to possess a firearm. Of course, it left open all manner of other restrictions and so forth, so the battle to preserve that fundamental right to keep and bear arms continues today and will continue for many, many years into the future. Our right to keep and bear arms, reflecting the fundamental right to defend oneself against whoever or whatever the enemy is, foreign or domestic, private or government, is under assault constantly. We see this in state efforts to limit the number of firearms that a citizen of that state might purchase. We see it in efforts continuously to limit the types of firearms that one might possess, and so forth. But there are some bright spots in these battles to preserve the right to keep and bear arms, Michael. As you saw, as I saw, just a couple of months ago, there were two very prominent state legislators in Colorado who were actually recalled. I think the head of the Senate was one of them, because of their open advocacy of firearms restrictions, that is gun control in Colorado. So the people by and large in this country, by a fairly significant margin, do understand what the Second Amendment means. They understand its importance, and they are finally awakened to how important it is to get out there and fight actively and openly and regularly for those rights. As you and I have talked also on a number of occasions, we also have assaults on the Second Amendment from the United Nations and from other countries, international bodies and so forth. So it's a constant battle, and that's why it's so important that people be reminded that, notwithstanding the fact that we have the Second Amendment codified in the Bill of Rights, in the Constitution, notwithstanding that we now have a Supreme Court decision that says clearly the right to keep and bear arms protects an individual right, that's not the end of anything. We have to constantly be fighting to make sure that that right is fundamentally preserved.
You know, words change over time, and people, as they read the Second Amendment today, do not understand the word regulated as it was written back then. Regulated today means typically government regulation, government control. But regulated as it was written and understood then was to be trained, a well-trained militia, well-regulated militia. And the militia was comprised of everyday citizens, and we remember Paul Revere's ride calling people to arms, and basically when the volunteers came out of their private homes with their firearms collectively together, they were a militia.
You're absolutely correct and historically accurate.
If we look at Amendment 4, and that's another very important topic for you, and it reads, the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrant shall issue but upon probable cause supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the person or things to be searched. Could you comment on that in today's light of NSA and the FISA court? And my goodness, just within the last several days, we've heard that foreign nations, not subject to our Constitution, but Brazil and France, are very upset because their databases are being searched by NASA. So we're not the only ones offended.
As two students of Ayn Rand, for example, here, you and I both know, as Ayn Rand wrote about, for example, in the Fountainhead back in the 1940s, the fundamental underpinning of civilization itself, a civilized society, is the right to privacy. As Ayn Rand wrote, if you take away a man's privacy, you gain the absolute power to control that person. And she was absolutely correct. Now, of course, Ayn Rand came about 150 years or so after, or 200 years after our framers crafted the Fourth Amendment. But our founders understood very, very clearly also that the fundamental right to privacy, the privacy of one's ideas, one's treasures, one's papers, and effects, is fundamentally essential to freedom and liberty. And therefore they incorporated in the Constitution, in the Fourth Amendment, a fundamental right of privacy to be secure against a snooping government in your personal papers and effects, in your person. And our founders recognized that there certainly would be circumstances in which government needed to legitimately gain access to a person's personal effects or private papers, for example, to prosecute criminal activity. But they also recognize that that right needs to be very carefully and clearly limited. And that's why they put that in the Fourth Amendment, why they incorporated the Fourth Amendment. Yet today, what we see, as you indicated, most recently, in the expansive power of the National Security Agency, the NSA, in conjunction with the FBI, which uses the powers of the USA Patriot Act. The NSA uses the powers of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, and the two of those have created essentially a perfect storm against any semblance of privacy. So you have, for example, as we've seen, for instance, in the information released over the last couple of months by Eric Snowden, we see that the FBI and the NSA are working hand in glove to gain access to virtually any cell phone call, any electronic communication that goes overseas or might come from overseas, regardless of whether there's any inkling whatsoever that the person or persons who are being surveilled or electronically listened into, so to speak, are engaging or have engaged in any criminal or terrorist or national security limiting activity. And that is clearly contrary to the spirit of the Fourth Amendment. It's also contrary to the language and the intent, for example, of the USA Patriot Act. The USA Patriot Act did provide, I think it went too far, but at least it limited the ability of the government to gain access to information, your information or my information, in the hands of a third party. It limited it under a so-called business record exception. Well, what the FBI and the NSA are now claiming, I don't think they can do it with a straight face, but they are trying to claim that that business record exception means that the government can gain access to all telecommunications records that are in the hands of a telecommunications carrier, for example, because all of those millions of records that are constantly being expanded every day constitutes a business record. I mean, that's clearly contrary to common sense. It's clearly contrary to the language of the USA Patriot Act. It's clearly contrary to the intent of the USA Patriot Act, yet the government just does it. And thus far, we've not been able to see any court challenges work their way up to really tee that issue up. So it's very troubling because, as you know, every day that goes by, the government exercises a broad power like that, makes it more and more difficult down the road or at any point in the future to stop it or limit it.
We heard just 2 or 3 months ago the head of the NSA was questioned by Congress of NSA listening in on people's conversation and reading their emails. He said that doesn't happen willfully. It may happen occasionally, but not by intent. But if we look at CALEA, a law that allowed the telecommunications companies to open up to the federal government, it used to be in order to do a wiretap, you had to go through the Bell operating companies, and they would have to be see a court order allowing any type of wiretapping. But with the old mechanical devices, that was the process. With the newer devices, electronic devices, CALEA made sure that the federal government had a back door and could access that information directly. Now, they were still supposed to go through federal court judges in order to get a wiretap, but they could now, with CALEA, go in directly to the software and see everything that they wanted to see without having to get a wiretap, although it was illegal. But so when Eric Snowden said, I can see President Obama's email and I can hear his phone conversations, I knew at the time that he stated that he was basically correct. Do you have a comment on that?
You put your finger on both a piece of legislation and an important aspect of public policy that a lot of people aren't aware of. So I really appreciate your mentioning it. CALEA, or the Communications Assistance to Law Enforcement Act, is a very insidious piece of legislation. It was passed originally, I think, right before I was elected to the Congress in '94. I think it was actually passed in 1994 before I went up there. And it mandates in law that when a private company develops technology or software for communications, that it must do so in a way that facilitates the power and the ability of the government to listen in, to eavesdrop and surveil. And of course, the federal government has used that in the the intervening 18 or 19 years to gain access, without people even knowing about it, to all manner of electronic communications. And when these government officials sort of glibly appear before the Congress and say, oh, we're not doing something, or they sort of play these Clinton-esque games of it, semantics, well, it just depends on what the meaning of is.
The word he used was witfully.
Yeah, I mean, give me a break. I mean, and yet members of Congress, so many of them, not all of them, but the majority of them, whether they're in the House or the Senate, they just allow these things to sort of pass over. The fact of the matter is that we have high government officials very clearly misleading the Congress, to put it as nicely as one can, misleading the Congress, misleading the American people, and perhaps even violating the oath if they took an oath to testify truthfully. It's very, very important because it changes, as Jeremy Bentham said 2 centuries or 3 centuries ago, I guess it was, and when he constructed this thing called a panopticon, where you would watch, the authorities would be able to watch prisoners 24/7. It changes the way you think. It changes the way you behave if you think the government is watching you. Even if they're not, if the government succeeds in making the average citizen think that they're being watched or surveilled, then that accomplishes the purpose of controlling people. That's what this all boils down to, government effort to control people.
It's been disclosed in the past 3 or 4 months that NSA has been paying corporations to write backdoors into their software, whether it's a Google application or another application by a big company, that NSA now can go inside and see what is happening from the end user's standpoint of view. There are lots of issues that cause concern, but one of the main issues of my concern is that we know that we have electronic voting machines. And if NSA can go into other applications, they can certainly go into the voting machine applications and look at the votes in real time and change the votes. Of course, it's hard to prove, but since we do know that they are doing that with other pieces of software, we have to be suspicious that that also might be something that they would do. Or do you see that as a realistic concern, or one that we shouldn't be concerned with?
Michael, it is patriotic to be suspicious of government. Our framers, our founders were suspicious of government. They had seen government abuses over the years by the tyrannical way in which the British Crown and its soldiers and its governors and its officials in the colonies trampled on the colonialists' fundamental human rights, such as the right to be let alone, such as the right not to have the government spying on you without a good reason, such as the right to have to be forced to testify against yourself. They were suspicious of government. It is patriotic to be suspicious of government. We need to be suspicious of government because we know to a certainty that government is taking advantage of what you've correctly identified as the digital technology. It makes it infinitely easier for the government to surveil people, to gather information, to retain that information, to data mine that information with digital technology that would have been undreamed of in the analog technology age. So the fact of the matter is that the technology now makes it possible for government to basically collect information on every electronic communication and to store it and to data mine it and to use it and to retrieve it whenever it wants to. And yet, as that technology has greatly enhanced the ability of government to invade our privacy, we the people have allowed this to progress without placing any reasonable limitations on what government is doing. And indeed, as you indicated, we even have some companies that are engaged in sort of an alliance, an unholy alliance as it were, with government, because of course corporations, some corporations, they rely on gathering information, using information on customers and consumers to control them in the same way that the government does. That's why it's so important for companies to stand up to what government is trying to do. Unfortunately, government is very powerful and can be very intimidating. There was a company that just opted, a small company, Lava Link or something, that went out of business, said, we cannot stay in business because if we do, we're being forced by the government to disclose the keys to decrypt our customers' data. And they have contracted with us in the marketplace to provide that security. And if the government comes in here and forces us to disclose it, we are violating our obligation to our customers. We're a small company, we can't afford to fight this, so they just went out of business. That is extremely frustrating to see that sort of result from government pressure.
President Obama, by some indications, has issued more executive orders than all former presidents combined, and one number I heard, and I haven't verified, is 900 executive orders in the past 5 years. Now, what was the intent of the executive order? And I don't know where in the Constitution that is defined, but it is more for the administration of those branches of government under the executive branch, or does it extend outside the executive branch? Where are the limitations and what should be the focus of executive orders?
Executive order is not defined in the Constitution, but the ability of the President as the chief executive and those under him to issue orders regarding the internal administration of the executive branch makes common sense. And so long as executive orders, the first of which was issued by George Washington, and every president since then has issued at least some executive orders, but they are coming with increasing frequency in recent years, unfortunately. Having an executive order simply to administer the executive branch makes sense. What's happened in recent years, though, is more and more is that presidents are using executive orders which carry within the executive branch the force and effect of law. They're using those to dictate public policy outside of the executive branch. And that's extremely dangerous because an executive order is never reviewed by the Congress. Many of them are never even made public, Michael. They're classified, they're in secret. And yet, with increasing frequency, they're affecting business interests and people's rights outside of the executive branch. And yet Congress basically just sits back, by and large, and says, we're not going to do anything about it. There have only been, over our entire nation's history, only 2 executive orders that were successfully challenged, that is, deemed to be unconstitutional. One was when President Truman sought to nationalize the steel industry during the Korean conflict. The Supreme Court, that was challenged, and the Supreme Court said that was unconstitutional. The only other time that there's been a successful Constitution challenge to an executive order was under Bill Clinton, when he tried to institute what's called strike or replacement through executive order. And a number of private businesses and business groups challenged that successfully. Unfortunately, it takes oftentimes a lot of money to successfully challenge one of these executive orders, and frankly, the federal courts don't make it easy. They place a lot of roadblocks in the way of an individual citizen or a corporate citizen in this country being able to challenge these acts of the government. And as I say, more often than not, Congress just sort of sits back when a president issues an executive order that basically trumps what Congress has done or usurps Congress's power and does nothing about it.
Why would Congress let their power be usurped without a challenge?
It's a very, very good question, and one of the reasons I think is that going back to our system of government, we have basically a two-party system in this country. And the Republican Party, when they're not in power, they know basically that that they will get back in power at some point, and if the Democrats are out of power, they know that sooner or later they'll get back in, so that it will swing. The pendulum will swing, but only so far. I think oftentimes what happens is a Republican Congress won't really press a Democratic president, even though that Democratic president might be going too far, because that could establish a precedent for limiting power when they're back in power. That's part of it. The other part of it, frankly, is that most members of Congress often, I think, don't even recognize that what's happening here is we have a separation of powers problem. The administration is usurping Congress's power improperly. Of course, if Congress doesn't recognize that, then they're not going to stand up and fight for it.
We're drawing near the end of our time, but if you would, tell us what are the top three most critical issues facing our country today as you see them?
At its core, the most critical issue facing our country is what we have been talking about here for this half hour or so, and that is disregard for ignorance of the Constitution. We have to get back to an understanding, a broad understanding of the Constitution. We have to reignite in people the love for the Constitution so they'll stand up and fight for it. First of all, they have to recognize it is being attacked, that their liberty is being taken away, and then stand up and fight for us. I think, secondly, Michael, is the tremendous increase in the national debt, which is very quickly approaching, or maybe even as we've sat here, exceeded $17 trillion. And that's only the tip of the iceberg. The actual national debt is much deeper than that, because you have these tens of trillions of dollars of unfunded mandates out there with the so-called entitlement programs. That is clearly something that either has to be addressed and has to be fixed, or will sink our country within a short period of time. And thirdly, I'd say would be tax reform. One of the worst things that we ever decided to do in this country was to give the government the power to take money from people's income. And then during World War II, by legislation, to allow the government to do it before you even get your paycheck, the withholding. Giving the government the power to tax income gave it a virtually unlimited amount of power. It can exercise as much power over individuals as it wants to, simply by taking more and more money through income. So those, I'd have to say, Michael, are probably, if not among the top three, clearly the top three issues.
Well, Congressman Barr, we are out of time, but we appreciate your taking the time out of your busy schedule to have an extended conversation on your views as you seek to become the next congressman for Georgia's 11th district. And we'd love to have you back again in the near future. Thank you.
Listen, there's nothing more important than the Constitution. You don't have to twist my arm very far in order to get me to talk about it.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael.